overlooked potential. The conference room of Nexus Innovations buzzed with anticipation as the quarterly review meeting approached its conclusion. The sleek glass walls reflected the Seattle skyline, a fitting backdrop for a company at the cutting edge of predictive analytics software. The CEO, Elliot Winters, surveyed the room with a critical eye as the last presenter gathered her materials. And finally, we'll hear from our newest engineering intern, announced Vivian Porter, the HR director, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dahlia Reeves will present her initial findings on the user interface optimization project. A slender young woman with copper-brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail approached the front of the room. Unlike the other employees in their tailored business attire, Dahlia wore a simple blouse that had seen better days and slightly worn slacks. Her hands trembled slightly as she connected her laptop to the projector. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice soft with a hint of an Appalachian accent she couldn't quite hide. "I've been analyzing the user interaction patterns for the projection screen," suddenly flashed with what appeared to be a chaotic jumble of handwritten notes, sketches, and personal reminders rather than the expected professional slides. A message about calling her grandfather was visible in the corner. Snickers erupted around the room. Dahlia's face flushed crimson as she frantically clicked to find her actual presentation. "Perhaps next time prepare before wasting everyone's time," muttered Jason Thorne, the development director, just loud enough to be heard. Elliot watched with narrowed eyes, not at Dahlia's mistake, but at the barely concealed delight of his executives witnessing her discomfort. He was about to intervene when something on the screen caught his attention, a pattern in what initially appeared to be random doodles and notes. "Ms. Reeves," he said, rising from his chair, "could you go back to that first screen, please?" The room fell silent. Dahlia, looking mortified, clicked back to her notes page. Elliot approached the screen, studying what others had dismissed as disorganized scribbles. He recognized what appeared to be a completely novel approach to their interface architecture that seemed to solve a problem his team had been struggling with for months. "Everyone except Ms. Reeves is dismissed," he announced suddenly. As the room cleared with confused murmurs, Elliot turned to Dahlia, who stood rigid with embarrassment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked, pointing to her sketches. "I am sorry about the mix-up, sir," she stammered. "Growing up, we couldn't afford many computers, so I had to visualize systems before I could test them. My grandfather taught me to see patterns where others see chaos." Elliot nodded slowly. "The timber mill family from eastern Kentucky." Dahlia looked surprised. "Yes, sir. How did you know?" "Just a guess," he replied, though something flickered in his eyes. "Everyone here thinks in the same Silicon Valley patterns, but you see things differently." He gestured to her notes. "This approach to the user navigation flow, it's unconventional, but it might solve our retention problem. The team has been too focused on industry standards to see it." For the first time, Dahlia stood a little straighter. "My grandfather always said solutions hide where people aren't looking." Elliot smiled slightly. "Tomorrow morning, my office, 8 a.m. Bring these notes, the actual ones, not whatever presentation they wanted you to make. I think you might be exactly what Nexus needs right now." As Dahlia gathered her things, still processing what had just happened, Elliot watched her with a thoughtful expression. There was something familiar about her approach, something that stirred distant memories he'd long buried. Beneath his success, what neither of them realized was that this awkward first presentation would be the catalyst for changes that would transform not just Nexus Innovations, but both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The second chance word of Dahlia's private meeting with CEO Elliot Winters spread through Nexus Innovations like wildfire. By noon the following day, speculation ranged from her imminent termination to wild theories about nepotism. Few considered the possibility that her unconventional thinking might actually be valuable. "You can't be serious." Jason Thorne's voice carried through Elliot's office door despite his attempt to keep it lowered. "The Palmer account is worth millions. We can't put an inexperienced intern on it, especially one who can't even manage a basic presentation." Dahlia sat in the reception area outside, clutching her notebook filled with the same chaotic notes that had caught Elliot's attention. She pretended not to hear, though each word landed like a small stone against her confidence. Inside the office, Elliot remained unmoved. "The Palmer project is failing precisely because we're approaching it conventionally. Their manufacturing systems are outdated, and our standard analytics framework isn't adapting. We need someone who understands how to work within limitations." "And you think some girl from the backwoods is the answer?" Jason's tone was incredulous. "That girl designed an interface solution using principles I haven't seen since my early days coding on systems with a fraction of today's processing power," Elliot replied coolly. "When resources are limited, creativity flourishes. The team has 3 weeks to incorporate her approach, with her as project consultant." When Jason stormed out, he barely glanced at Dahlia. Minutes later, she was called in. "You'll be working with the Palmer team," Elliot explained, studying her reaction. "They produce agricultural equipment for small to mid-sized farms but need better predictive maintenance software. Their systems are ... challenging." Dahlia nodded slowly. "Limited bandwidth, older sensors, rural deployments with spotty connectivity." Elliot smiled slightly. exactly the problems they've been having. How did you know? My community back home, she replied, opening her notebook. Farmers couldn't afford the premium systems, but still needed to prevent equipment failures during critical harvest windows. My grandfather and I jury-rigged monitoring systems using repurposed parts. For the first time, Elliot noticed calluses on her hands that didn't come from typing code. You actually built physical systems. Had to, she said simply. Theory doesn't feed people. When a combine breaks down mid-harvest, the following weeks tested Dahlia's resilience more than her technical skills. The Palmer team, led by a reluctant and resentful senior developer named Rebecca Quinn, initially sidelined her completely. Just sit in on the meetings and try to keep up, Rebecca instructed on Dahlia's first day, not bothering to hide her disdain. We'll handle the actual development. But Dahlia had grown up being underestimated. Rather than fight for recognition, she quietly observed, taking notes in her distinctive visual style, mapping connections others missed. During her evening hours, she developed prototypes in her small studio apartment, the same way she'd worked on her grandfather's kitchen table with resourcefulness, born of necessity. 3 days before the internal deadline, Rebecca's team hit a critical impasse. Their elegant solution worked perfectly in the lab but failed when tested against Palmer's actual operating conditions. The latency is killing us, Rebecca admitted during an emergency meeting. The algorithm needs more processing power than their systems can provide. What if we don't fight the latency? Dahlia spoke up for the first time in days. The room fell silent as she approached the whiteboard. Instead of trying to process everything in real time, what if we use the patterns and the noise? With quick, confident strokes, she sketched a solution that seemed counterintuitive, embracing the system's limitations rather than trying to overcome them. This can't possibly work, Rebecca objected, but her eyes remained fixed on the diagram, her brow furrowed in concentration rather than dismissal. It worked for weather prediction systems in remote stations back home, Dahlia explained. When you can't get perfect data, you learn to extract meaning from incomplete patterns. To everyone's surprise, Rebecca slowly nodded. We'd need to rebuild the core logic. But, theoretically, this approach requires about 60% less processing power. That night, Dahlia received her first collaborative message from Rebecca. I think you might be onto something. Can we review your full notes tomorrow? In his office, Elliot reviewed the team's sudden change in direction with satisfaction. He'd recognized something in Dahlia that reminded him of himself long ago, before success, before Nexus, when necessity had been his greatest teacher. What he couldn't yet see was how desperately the company would soon need exactly that kind of thinking, or how it would connect their pasts in ways neither could anticipate. Crisis Point. The Palmer project launched with uncharacteristic humility from the Nexus team. Rebecca Quinn, who had initially been Dahlia's most vocal critic, now spoke of collaborative solutions and adaptive frameworks during the final presentation. Though Dahlia's name was mentioned only briefly in the credits, Elliot noticed how the core architecture reflected her distinctive approach. 2 months later, on a rain-soaked Seattle morning, the crisis began with a simple notification. System-wide anomaly detected. By noon, Nexus's headquarters had transformed into a war room. Their flagship products, the Predictive Analytics, a platform that powered everything from supply chain management to financial, were forecasting for over 200 Fortune 500 companies, was generating increasingly erratic results. Client calls flooded in as critical systems made nonsensical predictions, threatening millions in losses. It's spreading through the entire network, explained Fiona Wu, the head of infrastructure, her normally composed demeanor cracking under pressure. Something in the latest update is causing cascading failures in our prediction models. Elliot surveyed the room of brilliant engineers, graduates from prestigious universities, veterans of tech giants, all looking increasingly desperate as conventional solutions failed one after another. Where's Dahlia Reeves? He asked suddenly. Jason Thorne scoffed. The intern. This is hardly the time for. She's been reassigned to documentation since Palmer launched, Rebecca interrupted, looking uncomfortable. Standard procedure for project completion. Elliot's expression hardened. Get her now. When Dahlia arrived 15 minutes later, the situation had deteriorated further. Medicor, their largest healthcare client, had just reported critical failures in patient flow prediction systems across 17 hospitals. Ms. Reeves, Elliot said as soon as she entered, we have a system-wide failure affecting our core prediction engines. Every conventional approach has failed. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the young woman who still carried her notebooks rather than a tablet. If she was intimidated by the sudden attention from Nexus's senior leadership, she didn't show it. May I see the error patterns? She asked quietly. For the next 20 minutes, Dahlia studied the data, scrolling across multiple screens. While others saw only catastrophic failure, her expression gradually shifted from concentration to something approaching recognition. It's not a code failure, she finally said. It's an environmental response. What does that even mean? Jason demanded. Dahlia approached the main display. Your systems are designed for ideal conditions, clean data, consistent inputs, but the real world isn't clean. She pulled up a satellite weather map, There's been unusual solar flare activity this week, creating small electromagnetic anomalies. Your standard systems ignore this as background noise. But the anomalies create patterns that compound through prediction models. Rebecca finished, understanding dawning, like weather affecting old radio signals. Dahlia nodded. Where I grew up, we couldn't just replace equipment when environmental conditions changed. We had to adapt. She opened her notebook, revealing diagrams that seemed prepared for exactly this scenario. Your system needs resilience protocols that recognize environmental variables, not just data variables. Implementing something like this would take weeks. Jason objected. Not if we apply it as a filtering layer rather than rebuilding the core, Dahlia countered. She looked at Rebecca, similar to how we approached Palmer's latency issues. For the next 18 hours, Dahlia led a small team implementing what she called a noise interpretation framework, essentially teaching the system to find patterns in what it previously dismissed as interference. While the solution seemed counterintuitive to engineers trained to eliminate noise, Dahlia's approach embraced the chaos, using it as an additional data source rather than an obstacle. By dawn, Medicore's systems stabilized first, followed gradually by other clients. The catastrophic failure had been averted, though the final cost in client confidence remained to be calculated. As the crisis team finally dispersed for a few hours of much-needed rest, Elliot found Dahlia alone in the conference room, organizing her notes. That wasn't just theoretical knowledge, he observed. You've dealt with system failures under pressure before. Dahlia looked up, exhaustion evident in her eyes, but also a quiet pride. The winter I was 16, a blizzard knocked out power to 3 counties back home. The hospital generator failed, and they had patients on ventilators. She closed her notebook. My grandfather and I rigged a backup system using parts from his old truck and solar panels we'd been experimenting with. Not elegant, but it kept people alive for 36 hours. Elliot studied her with new understanding. Your grandfather sounds like a remarkable man. He was, she said softly. He passed last year, but he's the reason I applied to college, then here. He always said solutions exist everywhere if you're willing to look beyond where everyone else is searching. Something in her words resonated deeply with Elliot, stirring memories he'd long suppressed. Dahlia, he said carefully, was your grandfather's name Winston Reeves? Her surprise was evident. Yes. How did you? I think it's time we had a proper conversation, Elliot replied. Because if Winston Reeves was your grandfather, then our meeting isn't the coincidence I thought it was. As they left the conference room, neither was aware that this crisis had not only saved Nexus, but was about to reveal connections between their lives that would reshape both their futures in profound and unexpected ways. Asterisk recognition and revelation. Executive dining room sat empty in the pre-dawn hours as Elliot ordered coffee for himself and Dahlia. The crisis had been averted, but the revelation hanging between them seemed almost as momentous. I grew up in Pinecrest, Elliot began, watching recognition flicker across Dahlia's tired face. That's barely 30 miles from my hometown, she said. Elliot nodded. My father worked the coal mines until the accident that left him unable to work. We were on the brink of losing everything, our home, what little we had. He paused, the memory still sharp despite decades of distance. Your grandfather owned the hardware store, and the repair shop behind it, Dahlia added softly. He fixed everything for everyone. He did more than fix things, Elliot said. When the bank was foreclosing on her house, Winston Reeves paid our mortgage for 6 months. Anonymously, I only found out years later when I came back to settle my parents' estate. Dahlia smiled sadly. That sounds like him. He never talked about helping people. He just did it. He gave me my first computer, Elliot continued. An old refurbished thing he'd rebuilt from parts. Said I had the right kind of mind for it. He looked at Dahlia directly. He changed the course of my life, and I never properly thanked him. Is that why you singled me out after the presentation disaster? Dahlia asked, sudden understanding in her eyes. Elliot shook his head. I had no idea who you were until just now. I recognized something in your approach, the same practical ingenuity Winston showed me all those years ago. The connection is ... remarkable. The days following the crisis transformed. Dahlia's position at Nexus, her noise interpretation framework became the foundation for a more resilient version of their core product. What began as an emergency fix evolved into a competitive advantage systems that could operate reliably even in unpredictable conditions. At the company-wide meeting announcing the new direction, Elliot did something unprecedented. He gave Dahlia full credit, inviting her to present the technical overview herself. Our newest approach embraces variability instead of fighting it, she explained to the assembled staff, her confidence growing with each word. By looking for patterns within what we previously dismissed as interference, we've created more adaptive systems. Watching from the side of the stage, Elliot saw not just a promising engineer but a reflection of the path not taken had his life circumstances been different. Had he maintained the connection to his roots that Dahlia had. The announcement that concluded the meeting stunned everyone, especially Dahlia, effective immediately. We're establishing a new division focused on accessible technology for underserved markets, Elliot declared. Dahlia Reeves will lead this initiative as Director of Adaptive Solutions. The whispers were immediate and Intern promoted to director. Jason's face reddened with barely contained objection, while Rebecca gave a small, approving nod. Later, in Elliot's office, Dahlia confronted him directly. I'm grateful, but I don't want charity because of your connection to my grandfather. This isn't charity, Elliot replied firmly. It's recognition of the perspective we've been missing. The crisis showed me that Nexus has become too removed from the real-world conditions most people navigate. We need leadership that understands how to create technology that works for everyone, not just those with the newest devices and fastest connections. He handed her a proposal outlining the new division. Your grandfather helped people because he understood their actual needs, not what someone in a distant office thought they should need. That's the philosophy I want at the core of this company moving forward. As Dahlia reviewed the document, Elliot added quietly, consider it my way of honoring Winston's legacy and ensuring Nexus remembers its own humble beginnings. Transformation 5 years passed with remarkable swiftness. The Adaptive Solutions division that began as Elliot's seemingly impulsive announcement had grown to become nearly a third of Nexus's business. Under Dahlia's leadership, they developed technologies specifically designed for regions with limited infrastructure, rural communities, developing nations, disaster-affected areas, markets the tech industry had largely ignored as unprofitable. On the anniversary of the division's founding, Elliot and Dahlia stood together on the roof garden of the newly completed Nexus Center for Accessible Innovation. Winston would have loved this view, Dahlia remarked, looking out over the Seattle skyline to the distant mountains beyond. Elliot nodded. And he would have been proud of what you've built, for patents, technology in 17 countries, and actual impact where it's needed most. We've built, Dahlia corrected him. None of this would exist if you hadn't seen something worth salvaging in that disastrous first presentation. The rooftop had been set up for the evening's celebration, the launch of their most ambitious project yet, a decentralized healthcare monitoring system designed specifically for remote communities. Inspired directly by the jury-rigged solution Dahlia and her grandfather had created during that long-ago blizzard. The board wasn't convinced this path made business sense, Elliot admitted. Even now, some of them see it as charity rather than strategy. Then they're not looking at the right metrics, Dahlia replied. Our retention rates are nearly double the industry average because we build for real conditions, not ideal ones. She smiled. Turns out understanding limitations makes for better technology. Below them, employees and partners began arriving for the celebration. The company culture had transformed alongside its business model. Where Nexus once hired exclusively from elite institutions, they now actively recruited from community colleges, technical schools, and non-traditional educational backgrounds, finding innovative thinkers who understood firsthand the challenges their technology needed to address. I've been thinking about succession planning, Elliot said unexpectedly. I founded Nexus to create something meaningful, but these past 5 years have shown me how much more it could be. Dahlia looked at him in surprise. You're not seriously considering retiring. You're only 53. Not retiring, he clarified. Evolving. The board will announce next month that I'm transitioning to chairman, focusing on long-term vision. He turned to face her directly. They've approved my recommendation that you become CEO. Dahlia fell silent, processing the magnitude of the offer. From disgraced intern to CEO in 5 years, she finally said, that's quite a story. It's the right decision for Nexus, Elliot replied. You understand both worlds, the technical brilliance we've always valued and the practical wisdom we nearly forgot. That dual perspective is our future. As guests began making their way to the rooftop, Dahlia touched the simple wooden pendant she always wore, a small carving her grandfather had made. His way of reminding her to stay grounded regardless of where life took her. 5 years ago, I was terrified of failing, she admitted. Now I realize that understanding failure, working with it rather than fearing it, has been our greatest advantage. Elliot smiled. Winston told me something similar when he gave me that old computer. He said, the advantage isn't in having the best tools, it's in understanding how to work with what you have. As they turned to join their guests, Dahlia paused. Do you think he somehow knew our paths would cross again? That you'd end up being my mentor just as he was yours? I don't believe in coincidence, Elliot replied. But I do believe in patterns, especially the ones most people overlook. He gestured to the gathering crowd below, a diverse group representing the transformation of both Nexus and their own lives. And the pattern I see is that the most significant innovations rarely come from where you expect them. Together, they descended to the celebration to people whose lives had been unexpectedly intertwined by one man's quiet generosity, now extending that same philosophy to technology that would help thousands. The humble beginnings that others had once dismissed had become their greatest strength, creating a legacy neither could have imagined during that first disastrous presentation that now seemed so long ago, and yet, in the patterns of their shared story, was simply the beginning of a circle finally completing itself.